Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Cup Interviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I will be your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, and I'm joined today by a very exciting guest. He is a multi-talented playwright, producer, actor, musician, podcaster, and many other hat-wearing roles here in the theater community. Well, here as in the cyberspace world, because that's where a lot of your work has been taking place since the beginning of the pandemic. So, Jack Canfora, hello. So happy to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Happy to be here, Ryan. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so great to have you. I look forward to talking about all of your exciting endeavors. But first, I always have to ask our favorite icebreaker question. What is in your cup today?
Well, I gave this some thought. I'm not going to lie. And I searched my house for the ugliest drinking receptacle I could find. And I think I succeeded in a big way. This was a gift, I am told, to my parents' wedding from whom I can only assume is like the Romulan ambassador to Starfleet Command.
Okay.
It's so, it's appalling. And there's like a set of and they're all differently colored, and I couldn't choose which one was ugliest. And I'm drinking a hard soda. Basically, one of the many things my friends make fun of me for is that I don't like, traditional alcohol. It always has to be sweetened in some sort of very, like I'm pledging a sorority in the 50s kind of way.
Of course. All right. Well, sounds interesting, looks interesting. To those who are listening to the audio-only version of this, you are missing quite the sight in terms of what this receptacle looks like.
It's just, who thought this was a good idea?
Someone must have. An artisan glass blower worked very hard to make that, and we are just insulting it to no end.
I know, but it was so long ago. They've long since died, and I would think the families just own their work. So,
well, there you go.
There you go.
Okay, and I am drinking coffee in the cup. There you go. It's a mug
there you go.
With our logo on it. Cool. That's great. So we're so happy to have you on the show. We want to kind of start with just tell us a little about yourself. How did you first get into theater? What are some of your relevant training, influences, experiences, projects, credits? The floor is yours to describe yourself how you please.
The scene is 1969. No, I moved around a lot as a little kid, and so I was a bit of an outsider because of that, and also because I just was. And doing plays, I found, was a way of not only being involved with people, but it was something that I was reasonably good at for a kid, and so I was getting positive attention, But I think the key for me has always sort of been finding a community of people, and that was always the big draw for me. And it was one of these things where I always just sort of assumed it would fall away at some point, and then it just never did. And then I started to take it very seriously in college, and I really wanted to study Shakespearean acting in particular, so I studied in London for a while. And I came back, and I did some work in my 20s, as an actor, and usually either Shakespeare or improv comedy, which is maybe a weird combo. But then I became a father, and my son, as I've said before, insisted on eating every day. So I had to get a day job, which was teaching, which, I love and loved when I was doing it. But so right before then, I had started writing sketch comedy, and I was in a sketch group, and it was great training as a writer because we'd write material, like an hour's worth of material, and play it live in front of audiences. It was the best possible type of schooling because they're very honest teachers, audiences, right? And so I learned on the fly. And so, but once I started working full time, I thought, well, how can I stay connected? Because I was really mostly an actor beforehand. And so I developed the writing. The writing was the thing I could do where I, at home and still be connected to the theater. And so I was very lucky in that my first full-length play was produced by New Jersey Repertory, and I had a couple plays there subsequently. And then I had a play called Jericho that rolled out in America as this National New Play Network thing. It won some awards. And so, I've kept at it since then. So that, in essence, is my origin story.
Yeah, that is a wonderful origin story, and what a great journey that you've had to navigate and really found your stride. So I think it's great. So you are actually currently, a lot of the work you do now is as artistic director of the online theater company New Normal Rep, or NNR.
Yeah.
And so how did that come about? What kind of projects has the company done so far?
Well, in the pandemic, pretty early on in the pandemic, like in April or so, I had just reached out to a bunch of my friends who were mostly actors, but theater people, and said, why don't we get together every week via Zoom and just read a play, any play we want, and we can play any roles we want, and it can be anything we want. And, it was partly to sort of keep, our head in the game that way, but also really just, frankly, it was just an excuse to sort of see my friends and talk to my friends. Excuse me. So we did that, and I think everyone really enjoyed it, and we had a great time. And then it occurred to a few of us that it was a really strong little company we were developing. And at that time, but by the fall, it still seemed that the pandemic was not going away anytime soon. And we started seeing people doing plays, online, and even the really, high caliber, money and talented people and companies, it felt like they were really stumbling, and like we all were stumbling to figure out how to do it. And it just felt like, a flat sort of reading, with music stands. And so we were wondering if, well, we know all the disadvantages, obviously, that, this medium has. We live it every day, but are there any advantages we can sort of lean into? And that's what we tried to do. And my friend, Eleanor Handley, who's a tremendously good actress, and she actually directed the audio play that's out now, but she described it as like, we set a little campfire in the dark, which I think is a great way of putting it. And we felt, once we started it, we thought, this is a great opportunity. I mean, we don't pretend it's the same thing as a theatrical experience, because one of the best parts of a theatrical experience is being in the same room with all these people, right? And so obviously that's taken away. And so there's no way to make up for that. So what we try to do is lean into it in a different way. Is we want to make it a sort of intimate experience. And we did 4 plays our first season. And we sort of developed, for lack of a less pretentious word, an aesthetic that we felt sort of worked for the medium. And, we learned as we went along. And we hosted a bunch of readings, which are very different than the productions we did. We did 4 full productions, which involved, green screens and things like that. And we didn't, we recorded them all separately, but we did it in a way that it could seem possibly that the people were in the same room. And it didn't feel to us like another Zoom meeting, which is the last thing we wanted. And so from there, we've liked this medium now that the pandemic has ebbed, at least temporarily, hopefully, sort of, kind of. But I don't think this way of communicating is going away. And one of the things we love about it is that, we're in New York based, and the theater is just ridiculously expensive. And it's become not part of people's daily lives. It's a very select demographic that sees plays. And so we wanted to sort of make that more accessible literally around the world, and also much, much, much more affordable, so that, almost anyone, basically almost literally everyone, could see one of our plays. And we really wanted to do plays that celebrated sort of diversity and new works, and maybe works that were underappreciated. Nilo Cruz did a play of his. It was our second play, and it had Jimmy Smits in it, which was in Daphne Rubin Vega, very exciting. But we also wanted to do plays that really featured our sort of company of actors, and we did a lot of that as well. And so, we're very proud of the first season, and we're hoping to move forward and adapt with the times.
Yeah. Wow.
God, that was a long-winded answer.
No, it's fine. There's a lot to say about it. No, there's a lot to say about it. So I think, it was fairly nice of you to unpack all of that. Like, I'll just say, it's really cool that you started just as like a play reading thing with friends. Yeah. Like, we've mentioned this on like our show a number of times, that this isn't necessarily the origin of Cup of Hemlock the same way it is of New Normal, but during like really a couple months before the pandemic, we had started something similar. And my co-artistic producer of the show, Mackenzie Horner, in the party room of his building, we would just go up and meet and read plays just aloud as actor friends or theater people friends do. And then, we were going to do it monthly. And then, 2 months in, suddenly there's this pandemic, and we started doing it weekly online, because what else were we going to do with our time?
Well, I was curious as to your experience of it. For me, it was a tool I relied on for sort of sanity. I had something to look forward to, and I could, kibitz before and after, in the middle sometimes, frankly. And it was, some people came and went depending on schedules, but there was definitely a core of people, disparate group of people. And I guess the one thing they all had in common is that I knew them and sort of invited them in. And so, that was just a lovely time. And tell me if you feel differently, but like, it really helped.
The sanity was a big part of it. I think so many people gravitated towards it and kept coming back. And it's interesting that you were the glue that brought all these people together. Like with us, it was a small group that started just meeting in a physical space before the pandemic. But then when it picked up to weekly, like after the pandemic, people were inviting their friends and so on and so on. It was this interesting network of people who were all coming together from like really all over the world. And again, that's the thing. People we would have never met otherwise, or would have had never the opportunity to meet, were now being brought together in this new medium.
Absolutely right. And it's funny because a little anecdote is two actor friends of mine who were in our production of Jericho, and in our production of Jericho, and their roles were they played a husband and wife. And so it was a very sort of, intimate sort of relationship in the play. And they got on like a house on fire too. And we recorded that in January, I think, of 21. And in November of 21, there was a play reading, and the two of them actually met in real life for the first time. But they'd felt like they had been friends, for a year, but they had actually never given each other a hug or, been in the physical space at the same time. So it's a strange sort of feeling that I think we're all sort of trying to process. But
yeah, it is wild. Like, I have friends who I've met like through those like Zoom play readings who I now run into at the theater here in Toronto and see them like there's like a moment like, you're shorter than I thought you were, or you're taller than like, there's always like this moment of like, oh wow, I feel like I know you so well, but I've only seen you from this.
It's a strange thing. When we recorded the audio play that I keep alluding to, I think it's Foreshadowing, and it's called Foreshadowing, and we recorded that together, and it was the first time we'd ever worked together live in the same room. And there were a lot of people that I had never met, but I was so excited to meet them. That was half the excitement of doing the flyout.
Yeah, it's special. And like, I love the name of the company, New Normal Rep. Like, it's interesting because we always talk about like, oh, is this the new normal? I think it usually has this like, cloud of like melancholic sadness to it. We're never going back to how it was. This is the new normal. But I love that you're spinning it on its head and saying that. Yeah, I don't know if you can comment on the name itself. But
yeah, I love the name, and I can say that because I didn't come up with it. Okay. I struggled. We all struggled mightily. And Jill Eikenberry, who is a board member and a founding member of the company, she was having dinner with her husband Michael Tucker one night, and he said, "Oh, you should call it New Normal Rep." And he struggled for months trying to come up with it, and he just gave it to us. So it was a great gift. And yes, I love it for that exact reason.
Mm-hmm. And even the idea of like a rep company, the fact that you have these multiple shows going on, and the fact that they're pre-recorded and anyone could tune in at any time, it like creates the audience experience of a repertory company without maybe the same mechanics from
exactly
the
right
side. Yeah,
exactly right. Yes, so we're very excited about that. I mean, again, we think it's akin to the theatrical experience, but it's not theater. So we all work and want to continue to work in theater, but we think this is a great way of introducing people to a theatrical experience. It's not television. It's not cinematic. I think, like theater, I think it allows a lot more room for language, which as a writer, and as a particularly verbose writer, I really like. And so I think it's a very different experience. One of the things we settled on early on is that the actor would directly would look right in the camera. And even it's clear that the two actors are having a scene, but they're looking at you. And there's something about that. One of the viewers said it felt like I was actually in the scene, and it was a sort of strange but wonderful sort of experience. And so, we love that idea.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. And yeah, it's obviously there's growing pains with these kinds of things. We need to kind of experiment, but you have to sort of get the ball rolling. And I think you and a lot of other interesting artists throughout the pandemic have just been trying and seeing what works, and that's the only way to really experiment and find out.
Yeah, exactly right. It's like the Wild West, and so it's terrifying without all the the genocide. But it's it's exciting, but it's also scary because we're not sure what we're doing. We're lucky because Jericho was the first of the 4 plays we did, and it was directed by Marsha Mason, and so really good. And so, but she was nervous too. She said, "Well, I've never directed a play for this," and so it was sort of a learning as we go. And we just sort of trusted each other's instincts, and so we're again. With each iteration, I think we're refining it, but I don't know if that's much different than actual theater, right?
Yeah. And I think your playwriting style, just based on what I've seen of it so far, like it is very like talking heads type of drama. And you mentioned that you're very verbose, but yeah, it is the language that communicates. Yeah, you're not writing like Peter Pan or Wicked or something that requires big spectacle that you really do need to see on the stage. Like I think for the types of plays you like, I believe. If I'm misrepresenting that, I think they fit very well in this medium, and I think that is working in your favor very well in terms of cultivating this medium.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, I do think, and again, it's our theater produces lots of other people, lots of other writers, obviously. But you're right. I tend to be wordy, and I think
in a good way.
Your opinions vary, but yeah, and it does sort of, like I said, I think it privileges language, and there's an intimacy to it. I think part of it is because of the physical proximity of the person, usually. The device, now, you can sort of aircast it and watch it on television as well, but it's just the person talking to you. And it's, I think there's an intimacy to that, and therefore it lends itself to a more conversational style.
Right. Yeah. And, we're all used to having these kinds of conversations on Zoom now, so it's sort of seeing characters, even if they're supposed to, within the fiction, be in the same room, we can kind of relate to the type of dynamic that we see them having face-to-face with each other in this way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Jericho and the other plays you have in the season. Jericho is one I thankfully got to watch. But yeah, actually, before we get into Jericho specifically, so what were all the plays in the season? You said there were 4 of them so far? Or?
Yeah, the first one was Jericho. The second one was A Cruise, Two Sisters and a Piano, which it had been performed before, but it hadn't gotten the exposure that Nilo had really wanted. And so he wrote it, obviously, but he also directed it, which was very nice. And then we had, the third play was by Nicole Salter, who's a very talented playwright and actress. She was nominated for a Pulitzer, I think, a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And it was called Lines in the Dust. And it was about, just very briefly, it's a great play. And it's about an African-American woman in Newark, New Jersey, who lies about her residence to get her daughter into a better, quote-unquote, school district. And there's someone sort of pursuing that doesn't quite buy that this is where the residence is. A powerful play. And the fourth play is by a young playwright named Julia Blauvelt, who is terrifically funny, and it takes place at a hedge fund overnight where there's some sort of crisis where all the accountants and bookkeepers have to account for something that's missing, and it becomes this great little microcosm of finance, the financial world, and all of its insanities. So that was our first season, and we thought, we were very happy with the quality of the plays.
Yeah, that sounds great. And it's so cool that you're not just featuring your own work, because I think when most people start their own companies, especially when it's a playwright, they usually are just featuring themselves. Like, nobody's producing my work, so I will start a company, I guess. But
that would be so icky, though, No, and to me, like I said, the big motivation for me has always been like friends and community, and so I wanted it to be something that all of us could enjoy. And I mean, I wouldn't be in the theater if I didn't have an ego, and so obviously some of my stuff's going to be in there, but it would just be horrible. Forget about the fact it would be aesthetically boring after a while. It's just like disgustingly, even my standards, too narcissistic.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, if you can indulge a little narcissism for now, let's talk about some of your works, because Jericho, as we've talked about already, is probably like one of your best known plays, and it was the kind of inaugural. So just tell us a bit about the piece, and something I guess I'm just curious about is, since you wrote it back in 2009, I believe was when it premiered originally.
Yeah, somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah. So what was it like to revisit it in this new format specifically, since it clearly was not written with this format in mind?
Right. It worked pretty well. We didn't have to do too many adaptations. We had to do some. There were a couple of moments of physicality that we had to sort of write around. And this is a silly example. There's one scene that ends in a kiss. And,
hard to do on Zoom.
Yeah. We have the person kind of smush their face up against the screen, but that would have been unseemly. And so, I had to write some dialogue to talk about the fact that they were going to kiss, which is not a very naturalistic thing to do, but, we think we got away with it. But it was fascinating to revisit the material. It performed, I think, in 2011 for the first time, and sort of in a few different regional theaters. And then it was Off-Broadway in 2013, I want to say. And a lot of the same cast that were in the Off-Broadway production were in this production. Another person, Michael Satow, an actor who was in a production in Florida, was in it. So they were revisiting the play for the first time in almost 10 years, including the central character, Beth, played by Eleanor Handley. And so, if anything, and they were all amazing in the original production, I thought, and really helped elevate my work and make me look smarter than I am. But I think that they'd actually deepened their, the 10 years had really helped deepen their exploration of it, and also getting to revisit it again, to do it yet. Yeah. So, it was fun. And also, when you put something away for 10 years and coming back to it, it was a fascinating experience, because to a large degree, the first few times anyway, I listened to it in rehearsals. I was able to listen to it like an audience member. Like, I had forgotten I'd written a lot of the stuff that I'd written, and which was nice, but also helpful, because there are things I thought, well, I can trim this, or I can lose this, I can change this. And so there wasn't that much of that, but there was a little bit of it, and I thought that was a great opportunity.
Oh, yeah, sounds great. And now you have a more recent play that has recently been released in audio form, also part of New Normal Rep, Step 9, which, at time of recording was recently released. Yeah, so talk about that piece a little bit. And was this one written with the audio-only format in mind, or did it have to be adapted to the medium?
It had to be adapted to the medium, but I have to say, and several people have said this already, that it was that maybe it was really very well designed for the medium naturally, maybe more so than the stage production. Because when I first wrote it, it was much longer than it is now, but it was, even now, we do it in episodes, but it totals about 2.5 hours, which is not unheard of long, but it's longish. And not to mention the fact that there are 7 characters, which in today's theater is like, for a cast of thousands, it becomes all but unproducible in a lot of places. So, the play itself is about a woman who, 30 years after she was raped in college, gets a letter from her rapist apologizing for doing so. And he's in recovery. He's a recovering alcoholic. And so and that's one of his steps is atonement. And that's where the title of the play comes from. But of course, that's step 9, also involving atonement, says that if your apology is going to cause the other person pain, don't do it. But this is actually based loosely on something that really happened. That premise was a news story that I'd read about and was fascinated by all the sort of questions it sort of brought up. And then I deliberately stopped following the news story. I don't know really what happened, but I thought that's just such a fascinating premise because, the character in the play has to wrestle with, do I want to revisit this? Do I want to press charges because I still can? But, is that something I'm willing to go through and put myself through? And so it's a play that the idea fascinated me of someone given this chance for, punishment, to punish someone who had done this irreparable, horrible thing to her with 30 years in between. What is the best path for her personally? And how does she balance that with what other characters, her mother and her daughter, feel are sort of larger societal responsibilities? That you have an obligation to have this person prosecuted and punished. And so that became an interesting sort of story for me to try and tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. I've listened to was it 8 episodes?
8 episodes, yeah.
I was struck when it ended on episode 8. I'm like, but the title has 9.
No.
But yeah, it's a really interesting piece. And those episode breaks, how did you, because I guess theoretically you could have released it in one big lump sum. So how did you decide to kind of do those breaks? And 20-ish minute increments.
Yeah, exactly. And we debated that, but we thought ultimately, and we released it all at once. So we thought, well, this gives people the option. They can listen to it in small pieces as they're driving to work or what have you. But otherwise, you're making a 2.5 hour commitment. And that is unusual for a podcast, right? And so, and in terms of doing the breaks, Eleanor Handley, who directed it, and I sort of went through it and thought, well, where's the most logical place to break? And we didn't worry too much about length. I mean, the average episode is like 18 or so minutes, but there's some episodes that are 22 minutes. There's one episode that's like 9 minutes, but we were like, well, no, this is the dramatically logical point to break off and do it. And so serializing it was fascinating to me. I'd never done that before with a play. And whereas as a stage play, 2.5 hours is a big ask. On an audio play, episodically, it's fine. It's a longer story. It's like a mini series. Mm-hmm. So that's how we decided to do that. And if someone wants to listen to it all the way through, of course they can. But
I did.
You did? Oh, good. Well, God bless. But yeah, and I think that the ending of it, I mean, like the blocking it off into episodes wasn't hopefully not too distracting. And so, yeah, that was our decision.
That's great. Yeah, and like I said, it's a very interesting piece, and like it's like nice now having just like very recently listened to it because it just came out a couple days ago, and now hearing the way you described it and the inspiration of it. Like the thing that I was struck, I guess this is mild spoilers for the piece, but the thing that I was struck about it is it took very different turns from where I expected that premise to take. And I maybe won't get into too much detail about what I might have expected or what happened differently, but I would say like the beating heart of the piece was very much this like 3 generations of women and the way they relate to each other, and specifically like what do we owe to the generations beneath us, like, and what, how do we explain things that are troublesome to our children and what we do with that. Like where did you find that as this kind of thematic impulse within the story that you were telling? Did that come early or later in the process?
It's sort of in real time. I don't ever start off with a play thinking, well, I have this theme that I want to, explore particularly. I just sort of, if it's working well, the story starts to tell itself a little bit. And then you come back and you reshape it and do all those things. But, the character, the mother played by Jill Eikenberry, she was a lot of fun to write. And but she became very vibrant and like had her own sort of say, so to speak. As silly as it sounds, as I was writing it, she basically said, no, this is where I want it to go. And so it became dialogue or trilogue between three generations and of women who are all ardent feminists, but different waves and different flavors of that feminism, and how they navigate the world as women. And their philosophy about it is very, they all want the same thing, but their approach to it is very different. And I thought that fascinated me more and more as I wrote it. And so I think that, if you're lucky, or if I'm lucky, when I'm writing it, I want to come back the next day and write and see what happens, and so and that's what sort of happened for me. And so you said it took a lot of turns that you didn't expect. It took turns that I didn't expect. Right. But, if it's going well for me, it's a good sign for me is that, I didn't realize it was going to go that way.
Yeah. As a writer, you're more of a gardener than an architect. You're just pruning the bushes and seeing where it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great analogy.
Yeah, I cannot take credit for that. I think George R. R. Martin has said it about his, approach to those long
credit. Ryan, he gets enough. You should take credit for that. Okay. I mean, and Tom Stoppard had a great, typically pithy way of saying it. Someone asked him, do you know the ends of your plays when you start writing? He said, well, if I knew the ends, why would I bother writing them? So which is a bit glib, but I think it gets near the heart of it. Absolutely right.
Although I'd say some of his plays, Real Inspector Hound comes to mind, that there's no way he could have written the beginning if he didn't know the end.
Well, I think, I don't pretend to have any insight to his working method, and I agree with you. My guess is that he got there and he's like, oh, now I have to go back.
Yes.
And I have to reach this. And I find I do that myself constantly, where I'm like, well, I like this angle, and so we're going here. Okay, cool. But that means I have to go back and adjust things here. And so there's a lot of rewriting as I'm writing. So I don't want to make it sound like this sort of stream of consciousness. There is a lot of architecture, but the architecture is meant to sort of fit around the stuff rather than
retroactive architecture after the garden has already flourished. Yes.
Oh, beautiful. That's great. Yes.
I love it. We're pioneering.
It may have been a haiku. I didn't count the syllables, but yeah.
No, we're close enough. Okay, so that's great. Like, I love hearing about these pieces. I guess this is just a funny thought that also came to me specifically because I watched Jericho first and then I listened to Step 9. I've noticed, I don't know if this is consistent in all of your plays, but something that recurs in your work, and that's ghostly apparitions that are actually a character's psychosis. That seems to be a recurring pattern, at least the two plays of yours I know.
I can't swear to that. I've written like 15-ish, 17-ish plays, and I think those are the only two it occurs in. It may occur elsewhere. I won't swear to it, but I think those are the only two it does absolutely recur in. Although, again, I can't swear to that. I don't pay attention to a lot of what I read. But I don't. What is a recurring theme is psychosis. Mm-hmm. That's definitely a recurring theme in a lot of my plays. The fine line between being engaged with the world and present and being overwhelmed by it. A lot of my characters, I've been pointed out to me, are constantly trying to find a way not to be overwhelmed by the world. So, write what you know.
Yeah. and writing or at least releasing works in the pandemic when a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed by the world.
Yes.
Yeah, it feels very apropos right now. So
it's true, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah. So you maybe hinted at this kind of earlier, but we'll talk about it a little more now, that because the pandemic is slowly but surely, easing up, and in-person theaters have certainly been gradually reopening, what do you think is the value of continuing to produce works online as opposed to saying, like, great, theaters are open, let's go back because we've missed it so much?
Yeah, because I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think it's an either-or. I'm very much desperately in favor of theaters opening and going back and doing theaters, and I'm desperately in favor of getting the chance to have plays of mine done in theaters. But I think the value of this online manifestation is, the two chief ones I can think of are accessibility, the democratization of the arts and theater in particular, or drama, I should say, in particular. It's just, prohibitively expensive, and it's geologically, maybe.
It's a lot of rocks going on here.
A lot of rocks. Yeah, certainly with my work. But geographically impossible for a lot of people to get to see quality theaters. You have to live oftentimes near Toronto, and I tried to say it the right way. I tried to say Toronto, not Toronto.
Toronto, as we say, the locals.
Toronto. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Or New York or Chicago, and of course there are many other places that have a theater that is, like the Guthrie in Minnesota, for example, or London. But I mean, there's so many other people around the world who don't have access to that. And one of the actors in our company, who's just a brilliant actor, his name is Jeffrey Bean, and he was in Step 9, in fact. And he grew up in Nebraska. And, he didn't have access to go in to see the theater, whenever he wanted. He had to sort of find it for himself. And so if we can make that a little bit more accessible to people, and also the work we do is we champion works that are new from new artists, from a diverse group of artists who it's either new or, maybe underappreciated and underproduced. And if that helps spark interest in subsequent live productions, all the better. But I don't think it's an either or situation.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that new normal rep as a company would ever produce things in physical theater, or are you committing this project to just doing online works as a complement to what exists elsewhere in person?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's tough to say what the future holds. I think right now we are invested literally and philosophically in doing it online or doing audio productions, which was a relatively new thought for us. And we kind of love that idea, actually. And so I think we'll probably be doing more of those as well as online things. It's difficult to say. I certainly would never say never to the idea of doing live theater as an NR. I don't think it's something that we would necessarily say no to if the right circumstances arose. But right now, our immediate plans are just to try and focus on this.
Yeah, no, I think it's a worthwhile pursuit. And, we've all seen, speaking for myself at least, so much like online theater, like at the height of the pandemic, and it kind of has petered out now that the actual theaters are reopening. So to see someone like you and your troupe being committed to think, well, we learned a lot in the process of that. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, because thank God we can go back. Like there were good lessons to take from that we can, take into our hybrid world that doesn't have to be either or online or in person, as you've said.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we found something that we think has value and works. And so, like you said, why throw that away? I mean, we can do both. The other thing we do that we're also committed to, which we think is very useful, is a new play reading series where we get writers who oftentimes haven't had the chance to hear their plays out loud, which, as you know, is just so incredibly valuable for a writer to hear their works and also give them a little exposure, but also just to hear their works read out loud. So we're very committed to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's great. And you also have your podcast, Playdate, it's called, the company's New Normal Rep. Do you want to talk about that a bit, what that does as a complement to the actual artistic works that are produced?
Yes, I would love to. And it's a Playdate. The podcast is called The Playdate, in a very painful, obvious pun. And it's hosted by myself and my friend John Scheffler, who's my college roommate. And the great thing about John is that he's involved, he's on the board of NNR, but he's not a theater person. He's kind of part of our target audience. He's a very smart guy, very educated man, cultured, but he hasn't any seen theater, but it hasn't been a real part of his life. And so we try and interview artists, theater makers. We've had a panel. We're just sort of starting out. But what's wonderful is that John is coming at it from someone who's very curious about it, but isn't sort of a theater insider. And, asking very interesting questions to me anyway about people who are in the arts and getting them just to have a conversation about what it's like to be an actor or a writer or a director in the 2020s, which is just so exhausting. 2020, I mean, not the act of creating art is exhausting sometimes, but just being alive in the 2020s is exhausting in all sorts of levels, in all sorts of ways. And it's a weird time, right? I think we all feel
strange and unprecedented, one might say.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And we feel a weird sense of dislocation. And so what's it like to make theater, which necessitates being present in a world that seems to conspire to keep you alienated? And so I think that's sort of the thrust of our conversation.
Yeah, it's a great mandate. I love when we have podcasters on this platform. It's like podcasters talking about podcasts on another podcast. Right. It's like when I've used this metaphor before, but it's like two pickpockets bumping into each other on the street and who's going to take each other's wallet. Like, yeah, happy to host a podcaster on this podcast.
Well, thank you. I mean, we're just starting out. You guys are seasoned pros.
Oh, but we also only got started in the pandemic, earlier in the pandemic, like we've talked about this before on the show, that this was, founded by other folks who are no longer with the company, who intended this to be like a theater company pre-pandemic. We was getting started just in the months leading up to it. And then this kind of became, what we do now. It was just something we were keeping the fire burning with during the pandemic. And we realized we liked this kind of more, or we're happy.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's wonderful. But it also speaks, it also speaks to the fact, I mean, theater companies are virtually impossible to maintain in the best of times. And these are not the best of times. I don't I don't want to be too subjective, but it's so hard economically, even more so. And so any way you can sort of maintain a commitment to that theatrical impulse, I think is wonderful. And this podcast is an example of that.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like this multi-part question I have coming up next feels a little redundant now because you've touched on pretty much all of the points already, but let's play ball with it and see if there's anything you'd like to add. So in the lead up to this interview, your publicist sent me this, what I found to be a very thought-provoking list of topics that you were interested in discussing, many of which you've alluded to already. So,
redundance never scared me.
Yeah. No, redundancy is great. You can never have too much redundancy. So, but I kind of just felt like these were interesting, thought-provoking topics that I didn't want to reverse engineer them into proper questions, but I'd love to just bring each one of them up and let you talk about them individually.
Great.
So the first one is relighting the storytelling campfire. Why sharing stories is the glue that holds cultures and communities together. Let's hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, and you and I, you're right. We have talked about this already, but I mean, I think it is worth revisiting because I think narratives are, they're just a natural way we communicate. We think it narratively. It's why we dream, and so I don't know of any culture, not an anthropologist, but I don't know of any culture that hasn't privileged narrative as one of its top priorities. I don't think that storytelling is a luxury. I think it's necessity. And I was parched for it during the pandemic. And I think a lot of people were. And that was an incentive for lighting that campfire.
Yeah, it's great. And I think this leads into the next one really well, which is live theater is not dead. It just needs some reimagining. How to make theater more available, affordable, and widely attended.
Yes. Well, I mean, again, it's not an either-or proposition for me. What I do worry, being in New York, looking at what's happening to theater in New York, and that in terms of it's just, there's a trickle-down sort of situation in which, Broadway is suffering, which, that to me isn't necessarily, it by no means constitutes what theater in New York is. In fact, sometimes it's the antithesis of that, of what I would consider in a lot of ways. But I mean, that's not just jealousy talking, but it's so hard to draw audiences in. They're suffering tremendously. And I don't know what the source of that is. I do think some of it is probably because a lot of the average theater goer in New York is old, and they are more hesitant to go into public spaces. And hopefully that's changing a bit. But I would love it if we tried to sort of break it down a little bit and start building up again. And, that if that means smaller theaters and, smaller, for, fewer people in the venue, so be it. But I think it's important to find a way to keep us alive, And the other thing to bear in mind, is if theater could survive, the plagues, and theater has always been on the verge, right, of dying out. We've been hearing this since Sophocles was probably told, theater's going out of the way, all puppet shows now, so, it just finds a way to survive, but we have to, I think, really be very attentive to that now.
Yeah. But it's interesting. You make a good point about how, like, the older audiences that, make up a lot of theater, and that's not just in New York, it's sort of in every large center where there is big theater, especially like large commercial theater, the older audiences tend to, and it's, a lot of them are immunocompromised and can't actually get out. I guess I'm curious then, sorry if this is a bit of a swerve question, but, that demographic doesn't tend to be the most tech savvy. And you riff on this in the play Step 9 with Anne, struggling with her TV. So do you feel like online theater is necessarily the antidote, at least for that community, in terms of what will be, servicing their theater or storytelling needs?
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. And the answer is with a little help from their friends. We've tried very hard to make it sort of very user-friendly. I am technically not savvy at all. And so I can relate to the frustrations. So we try and make it as user-friendly as possible. And we have a very, Carol Todd, who starred and stuff, who also, by the way, has a dual citizenship of Canada. She wanted me to tell you. So very proud of that. And so, but she, not only a tremendous actress, she edited it beautifully, but she's also just very good technically. And so she's endlessly patient with me and also with any who tried to log in and can't figure it out. We've been very lucky to have people be very helpful with that. But the second part of that is what we would love to do, and this is part of the democratizing theater thing.
It's the next one on the list.
Yeah, there we go. Is let's try and get people who aren't in their, old like me and older, to really enjoy theater, to see that the dramas like that have real purpose. And so if we can get people in their 20s and 30s activated and interested in it, then I think that's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that brings us right to this next topic: democratizing the theatrical experience, bringing theater home to underprivileged, underserved, and ignored audiences.
Yes, is the answer to that.
Yes, to that. That's exactly what you're doing. Good job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't need to say much more to it. You've already also talked about it a fair bit. This next one I thought was particularly interesting in terms of technological alternatives to theater. So how this ancient art form can evolve to keep up with the era of Netflix and chill. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't want to come across as anti-chill. It's the chill part. I am decidedly pro. But I love Netflix. I grew up an hour from New York City, but I didn't go to the theater much. I wasn't part of it. Theater was something that I had to seek out, and I think that. And I don't think it's an either or situation. I don't think, I think movies have to be more worried about Netflix and Amazon and what have you than theaters in that sense, in some ways. In other ways, yes, we are, but we've always been pushing that boulder up the mountain since a lot of stone metaphors today. And, since the invention of television, right? I mean, it will find a way. I'm not nearly smart enough to tell you or suggest how per se. But, movies, when movies came out, people said, theater, who needs to go to the theater? Well, people still needed to go to the theater. Same thing with television. Same thing with, now streaming services. I don't think it's a bad thing. To use a weird analogy, when baseball started broadcasting their games for free on the radio and then showing them on television, most of the owners of baseball teams were really opposed to it. They said attendance will fall off because they get into it or watch it at home. In fact, the opposite happened. It spurred interest. And so I think something like Netflix or streaming services, access to dramas, isn't necessarily a bad thing for theater. But what we have to do is be present enough in their consciousness to know that we are also a type of this and we are available. And that is what, we're in a very small way, we're trying to do here with NNR. Mm-hmm. Such a time saver. Saying new normal rep.
Yeah.
I would be here all night.
Well, yeah, but okay, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes up in this because you're right. There is this sort of technological idea that the new thing will displace the old, and that's historically hasn't been the case. Mm. But I would say the flip side of the coin that we could even read into that is that if we're talking about just the storytelling campfire in general, and that doesn't have to be theater proper, shared co-presence of time and space as we've historically known it. I would, maybe this is devil's advocate, but I would argue that Netflix and all the content on it is just another evolution of that storytelling campfire, that when all of us were in our homes during the pandemic, we did turn to stories on these platforms that, maybe didn't have the same immediacy that theater has for us. But, it's not that far from you putting a lot of this NNR work in a similar on-demand format online.
Yeah. And I don't actually disagree with anything you said. I watched Netflix. And I don't mean I watched on Netflix. I watched all the Netflix.
You just watched the whole Netflix.
All 53 years of material. I watched the Netflix. But it didn't stop me from wanting to, now that the pandemic is ebbing, or has ebbed, knock on wood, going out to see other things and going out to the theater. So it hasn't quenched my thirst to go see theater. And I also think it might, and this is really uncharacteristically optimistic of me, I think it might also show people that, there's all different sorts of stories being told that I have access to. And so it might help dovetail into something like theatrical productions.
Oh, it certainly does. It's funny just thinking of my own experience of things gradually reopening as the pandemic has. I have still barely been to a movie theater. I've gone maybe twice since the beginning of March 2020, whereas I've been to the theater pretty much weekly since they've started reopening. And part of the way I rationalize that for myself is that if you don't go to the theater to see the theater show, it will be gone and you'll never get to see it. Whereas any movie that I would maybe like to see on the big screen previously would have had no problem seeing on the big screen, I know will eventually be on a streaming service. So it's harder to rationalize that, do I need to go out, risk COVID to see this when there will be a safe in-home alternative later? Whereas the theater show, if I don't go now, it's my only opportunity.
Oh, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's the perfect answer to that. And that's sort of what I was going back to earlier. And by the way, obviously I'm not an expert in any of this, but I would think that movies have a lot more to worry about.
Yes.
I mean, there's some, I think I've been to the theater twice since then too. And, I think movies are maybe regretting their measure of, streaming it at home and showing it in the theater at the same time. It's, don't want to, I don't know, unring that bell. And so, but for theater, exactly right. It's more of an ephemeral experience in terms of how long the productions run, and also in terms of what it's going to be like night to night. And that to me is more exciting than ever because we're so used to that not being the case now, and getting to interact with a cast and with an audience, and so that's very exciting too. I don't think it's hurt theater. I mean, it has hurt. I think the pandemic has hurt theater a lot. I don't know that it's going to kill it. I doubt it.
No,
it always survives.
It clearly hasn't. Like, I think unless another big wave comes that really does, knock on wood, jeopardize things catastrophically. But I, at this point, have a hard time imagining something like that being worse than what we've already weathered. Like, and the fact that it has come back quite strong, in my opinion, like at least
absolutely
in metropolitan centers like New York or Toronto. I can't speak to the world at large, and smaller regional theaters probably got hit harder, but
very hard, and I'm not trying to downplay that or sound indifferent or completely oblivious to the very real pains theater is going through. But we're people who work in theater, we're used to always being up against it. We're used to always scrambling to figure out how to make ends meet. So I do have faith that if anyone, any group of people can survive and figure out a way to adapt, it would be theater people, because we've been having to do it all our lives.
Yeah. And, you're probably familiar with the play Mr. Burns, a post-electric play by Anne Washburn. Yes. Like, I feel like that, oh, trust me, that was one of the first ones we read in our play reading group when we moved to online, because it felt very prescient to talk about theater bringing people together after something like an apocalypse. Like,
yes, absolutely.
And returning to its roots in this very, whimsical postmodern riff on it, with The Simpsons being the mythology that they're pooling their stories from. But
by the way, my other cup is a Simpsons cup.
Oh, there you go.
So I was debating between the two. But yes, absolutely. I think, it's the way, and I'm not saying anything new or original here, but it's the way we sort of know that we are not alone, right? And that's the whole point of the campfire is apart from warmth, and it's feeling communal and feeling connected. And I think, not to go off on a tangent, but I think our culture has for years been slowly, whether through design or not, made it harder to feel connected. And the pandemic really, hit the nail on the head with that. And so that's why I think theater is incredibly important in any form.
Yeah. And I guess to the pandemic's credit, what a strange sentence to say, but yes, we were all so isolated in it, but I think it made a lot of people acutely aware of just how much they missed that, in-person social interaction. So, of course, when theaters did reopen, people did flock to them and are very happy to return, which, thankfully, some people's mileage will vary in terms of how, concerned they are and how, compromised they might be, of course, but this is certainly the case. But yeah.
I agree. I totally agree with you on that. It does make me far more grateful to be able to see a friend in person, to hug them, to sort of actually have that in the same room interaction. Having said that, I've experienced things where I've gone and seen friends and I've been so joyful at that experience, but I found myself exhausted because social muscles that I've built up all my life without realizing it had atrophied in the pandemic. It's just taking a while to build it up again. But it's, to use your phrase, to the credit of the plague, it does make us so much more grateful for the simple act of being in a room with another person. And maybe that's, it's hard to think of things that actually in the end matter more, right? And it's in talking about what we were talking about earlier, it's a society that does everything it can to distract you from that basic fact.
Yeah, no, indeed. So I guess we got two more points on this list. Let's go. Breaking down the barriers that are preventing underproduced, lesser-known playwrights from making it on stage. You've addressed this already, but do you have more to comment on that?
No, it's just that I think that, the more, for example, the reading series, several of the playwrights, not all, but several of the playwrights whose work we've read, I'm thinking in particular of one playwright who lives in Ohio and wrote a very good play and certainly worth hearing. And she wouldn't have had that opportunity to have, professional actors reading it and doing it. And so I think that's an exciting thing. And maybe her name gets out there a little bit more. And so I think that's a very worthy endeavor too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, again, you talked about the geographical component of that. Yeah. It's, it is kind of just amazing to think of how just where you live for, so long dictated what opportunities were available for you or to you so long, or are you willing to move to a metropolitan center that has a more vibrant theater community? And now, these people are making connections across boundaries and getting in touch with actors based in New York who are able to, cyberspace is becoming its own, facilitator of this in a useful way.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the last one on the list.
Okay.
Here is using the theatrical experience to change the culture of modern alienation. I again feel like we've addressed this already.
Yeah,
to one of belonging, empathy, and human connection.
Again, the answer would be yes to that. I think that, that's one of the things that's been pointed out to me that is the subject matter of my plays varies super widely, but one of the things that's been pointed out to me is that it's often about people trying to make real connections and community. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And I think that, again, it's something that our culture Western culture makes it hard to do. And so I think it's all the more important to make a conscious effort to do so.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And yeah, I think that's great. And the work you're doing definitely is, I think, making a great contribution to that.
And you too. You as well.
Yes, thank you. We'll steal each other's wallet.
Yes.
So I guess just a couple more things before we sign off. What other projects do you have coming up on the horizon, both yourself personally and New Normal Rep?
For New Normal Rep, we have a couple of irons in the fire, but before I forget, because I'm terrible at this.
Okay.
So I want to say that to listeners here of Cup of Hemlock. If you can go onto our YouTube page, New Normal Rep YouTube page, or you could just go to www.newnormalrep.org/bonus. And if you type in the password, all caps NNR, you can have free access to Jericho, which is full length play, full production. And that's completely free, as is our podcast/audio play, Step 9, which, it's available on all the major podcast platforms. So please check that out. And, for me, I have a couple of asked me a few years ago.
Garrett Davies, specify. You mentioned before we started recording that you're friends with Stratford legend Garrett Davies, but we have not said that on recording yet. So
thank you.
Mention that now. Yes.
Yes. So you listen to me better than I do. He asked me to write a play. So it was sort of like a commission, but without the money. And so as a friend, he thought it would be interesting to write about, as a therapist, treating stand-up comics. And so wrote a play, and we're happy with it, and we're seeing what we're going to try and do with that. I have another play I wrote about the relationship between Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley that we're looking for theaters. When I say we, I mean me and some friends of mine. I'm in between agents, as they say. And I'm working on a play now that is about the relationship between Amadeus Mozart and Beethoven. We know for a fact that when Mozart was 31 and Beethoven was 16, they met in Vienna. We don't know anything else about it. But so I wrote a play about that. And so we're looking for ways of getting that done now. So.
Well, that sounds really interesting. It sounds like a mix between Amadeus and Michael Frayne's Copenhagen in terms of imagining what happened in this meeting that we know about but don't know what happened in it.
Exactly.
If you need a tagline for your pitch, you can have that for free.
That's great. I'm terrible at elevator pitches because obviously I'm verbose. But and talk about it would be hubris if I had thought about it. Like, why would you write a Mozart character when it's done?
It is one of the most famous plays of the 20th century.
It's like me writing, I think I'll write Hamlet Part 2, but this time Hamlet is, owns a bar. No, but in this, it's a very different character than the one obviously portrayed in the famous play. And why? Because I wouldn't attempt to try and write a character like that. So that's what I'm up to these next few days. And then, working on making the podcast better. So. That's what I want.
That sounds great. So we look forward to seeing how all of these things unfold. And of course, you can always reach out to Cup of Hemlock if you'd like us to promote something that's coming up. We'll put the links in the code for what you've just said, the access to Jericho and Step 9. We'll put them in the description of this episode for people who want to check them out and don't need to pause to listen to the code and write it down quickly. So we'll have it copy and pastable in the description here. And then, just before we sign off, plug your socials for both New Normal Rep and yourself so people can find it easily.
Thank you so much. Yes. And before I quickly do that, I just want to say, because I think we said this before, but not recording. Okay. I'm a big fan of this podcast. And
so we're so happy to have you on. And yes.
And I'm even a bigger fan. So Twitter and Instagram is @Jack Canfora. New Normal is @NewNormal. And so please follow us both. Desperately needy for attention.
Okay, so again, those will all be in the description as well. And we're so happy that, the geographical boundaries have been truncated through these platforms. And we're so happy that we were able to get you on the show and have this wonderful conversation. And again, another thing we talked about before we start recording, you're wearing a Canadian Air Force t-shirt.
Canadian Air Force. And I'm very proud to do it. So I love Canada. Yes. God almighty, like so many of my friends, we are constantly thinking, well, Can we move to Canada?
Well, Canada will welcome you with open arms.
Well, thank you. I hope so. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you. So this has been great. Once again, this is the Cup of Hemlock Theatre. You can follow us at COH Theatre on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you're watching this on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe, all the YouTube things. Same with the podcast things. You've been on the internet before. You know how these things work. Jack, once again, thank you so much for being on the show. We love having you. And break a leg with all of your future endeavors.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Pleasure to be on.
Pleasure. Cheers.